Welcome to History with Mr. Ruck. I am Mr. Ruck, and in today's lesson in our classroom, we are going to take a look at who would have actually won the 1860 election. We've already learned about all the candidates, and now we're going to find out what really happened. Let's history. Okay, so we know who the candidates are for the 1860 presidential election. And at the time, they thought it was a big deal. And looking back, we know for certain that that election changed the course of history in the United States. States' rights is actually really used as the hammer blow to whether or not slavery can take place in the U.S. or whether it should. It's what a lot of people hid behind as far as whether slavery could continue. If you look at all of the candidates, they were all over the place except for Abraham Lincoln as far as whether slavery could continue. Most of the candidates, at the very least, said if you already had slaves in your state, you could continue to have slaves in your state. Now, from there were many other viewpoints on whether slavery should continue in new states, such as the new territories, as we pushed out west, like into Texas, and took over parts of Mexico and made them our own. Now, as we know from previous videos, cotton was a real cash crop for the South, and it was the lifeblood of their economy. So, when we consider, slavery or not slavery, for them, they didn't really even think of it as human rights. Not that that was correct, but for them, it was, you're going to destroy the economy in the South if you take away the right to slavery. Now, of course, for us, today, we are used to just two parties. Two parties. So it's wild, inconceivable to imagine that we could have four people running for president who have a legitimate shot at taking votes from other people, whether or not they could actually win themselves. The question, would Abraham Lincoln have won if there were only two parties running and really being supported? Now, in this election, the voting rules at the time were not what they are today. Voting rights were very individualized by state, and that's part of the reason why in our state of Tennessee, Abraham Lincoln is not even on the ballot, at least for our simulation, and in real life, he was not on the ballot either. So, when we would have voted, we wouldn't have had that as an opportunity. Now, it's a little different, though, as far as voting goes, because if you were not white, you probably would not have been able to vote. There were some states in the North that allowed minorities to vote, but predominantly most states were white only, male, 21 years or older. You could not be disabled. You must be of sound mind. You couldn't even be in the military in some states. Shocking. I know. Now, something else that is very interesting is when they voted, they had a piece of paper with all of the nominees that they were voting for on it. And that one paper was based upon different parties. So when you go back and look at the ballot that they filled out, there was actually a ballot for one party, and if you were going to vote for that one party, you would go to the voting area where you would turn in your vote, and you would actually turn it in and have to read off everyone who you were voting for everyone else to read, and it could only have been from the one party that you were supporting. So if you voted for Abraham Lincoln, you were voting for everyone on the Republican ticket across the board. And you had to read that out loud so that everyone heard it. And if you weren't comfortable with that, you may have thought twice about voting. Now, back then, they had 81% turnout compared to, in 2012, we had 57%, 51%, something like that. Now, that was of eligible voters, of course, because there was only about half the country that could vote in the first place. Now, as the votes broke down and they're tallied up, the interesting thing came to light that Abraham Lincoln wins. However, when you look at the electoral votes, it looks like it was a landslide. He gained 180 electoral votes. Compared to second place, Breckinridge with only 72, Bell with 39, and Douglas with 12. Stephen Douglas, the man who most recently had defeated him in the Senate not but 2 years earlier. In other words, 2 years go by, and somehow this guy who beat Lincoln running for the state Senate couldn't beat him in a presidential race. But that's the electoral vote. So when you break it down a little further and you look at the popular vote, Abraham Lincoln had about 1.8 million votes for him. Now, second place in the electoral was Breckinridge, and he had 848,000. Third place in the electoral votes was Bell, with a popular vote total of 590,000. And fourth in the electoral was Douglas, and his popular vote number was 1.38 million. What you're telling me is that if we take all those votes of people who didn't vote for Abraham Lincoln, all those people who thought that slavery in some form should still exist, whether for states' rights or not, that's more than Abraham Lincoln. Because he only won 39% of the vote. He only won 39% of the vote. Therefore, it's conceivable to think that if they had two parties, and it was again Lincoln versus Douglas like it was in the Senate in 1858, Lincoln would have lost. Douglas would have won and kept things the way they were, because he wanted to allow states who already allowed slavery to still have slavery, and those that did not have slavery yet to not be allowed slavery. So all those new territories that we're bringing into the fold of the United States in our manifest destiny westward expansion, they would not have been allowed to have slaves in their states. But America would have still been a slave nation. Okay, so we see that it's very possible Abraham Lincoln would not have won the election if it had taken place today with today's rules, etc., etc. It's probably kind of a shock. I know in doing my own research, I would have never guessed it. However, it's not about what would happen today. What we should take away from this video is how important this election was and how it changed our country for the better. Alright, I've been Mr. Ruck, and thank you for enjoying my history video about the 1860 election. We will see you next time. If you got anything out of this video, if it was jamming with you and you found out a couple little tidbits of information, please like, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time. Peace.